Welcome back to another episode of On the Beaten Track. I'm your host, Rihanna. Before we get into today's long overdue lesson that we'll be speaking about, I just wanted to say thank you very much for everyone that's engaged on all the content around June 16th. It really was such a pivotal moment to just individually bring out stories of the people that were there that day, and the cruelty that was a result of what could have been a peaceful protest. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And yeah, let's keep this moving. I've mentioned Steve Biko I feel like it's over the last 2 months. It might have been before that already. And today's episode, we are going to speak about the man, the legend. So reading his words in I Write What I Like and Donald Wood's Biko, I have been given insight into this man, the leader, and the community member, essentially, and you'll see why I make that specific distinction. Everything I've thought about Steve Biko has been enhanced and elevated by reading these and many texts and accounts about his life. And I hope that I have done it justice in the coming episodes. I said I was scared to do this, and after doing all the research, writing the script, taking out the parts that I wanted to, I'm even more afraid because I really, really want to do this justice. So come on this journey, and hopefully you feel that I will elevate him in your minds too. Many of his writings are so powerful that I feel cannot be rolled up into one quote or statement, but its entirety must be enjoyed. There are other people that I've extracted full contextual writings from them, because it's always good to hear from people who knew the man during that time. So as I started writing this, pulling out the quotes, putting it together, gone through it enough times that it's become a little bit of an obsession, and sometimes it must just be khalas, it's done, and put it out, right? I didn't know how many episodes would come of it. What I can confirm now is that we will be doing 3 episodes following his life to his death. Post the Biko series, we'll be looking at those people individually. Very interesting characters. Some people very impactful at the time, and then just disappeared, and there becomes less information about it. But I think it is just a symptom of the time that this all happened. This is what I know. Stephen Bantu Biko, he identified himself on the night the security police picked him up from the car with Peter Jones, Bantu Stephen Biko. We are going to follow his life from the red soil of the Eastern Cape to the interrogations of the security police, and then into courtrooms, the newspapers, and the conscience of the world. This is a story about ideas, about what happens when ideas frighten the government or a government, and about what that government does in response. We begin where all life begins, with a place, with a family, with the particular texture of a childhood. Bantu Stephen Biko was born on the 18th of December, 1946, King Williamstown in the Eastern Cape. He was the third of 4 children. His father, Masingaya Matthew Biko, was a government clerk who was studying to become a lawyer. His mother, Alice, known as Mamsete, was a domestic worker at Grey Hospital in King Williamstown. They lived in Ginsburg, a black township on the edge of a white town, which is to say they lived as nearly all black South African families of that era lived, in the part of the country that was designated for them, surrounded by the administrative machinery of a system designed to keep them there. So Biko's given name, Bantu, means people, is isiXhosa. Biko interpreted in the terms of saying, and hopefully I say this right, umtu, gumtu, gabantu. A person is a person by means of other people. I just found that really cool. His eldest son, Nkosinati Biko, said, people, especially from overseas, asked me why Steve was called Bantu. They think Bantu is a derogatory term or racist word, but in Bantu, with a soft B, it means the one for the people. To Bandi Biko, her eldest brother, was like any young boy growing up in the township. Though Bandi described Steve as a lazy boy, she had fond memories of a brother as a naughty schoolboy and an entertainer who had a great sense of humor. She said, he was very well liked by his peers and friends and started showing his leadership qualities at a very young age. His friends usually fetched him from his home to play street football barefooted. They would not begin a football game without him. When Steve was 4 years old, his father died while studying towards his law degree. His mother raised the children largely on her own. It was a childhood shaped by absence and resourcefulness in equal measures, and by the inescapable presence of apartheid as the organizing principle of every waking hour. By all accounts, Steve Biko was a conspicuously gifted student. He first attended Charles Morgan Primary School in Ginsburg before winning a place at Lovedale Institution. We've spoken about Lovedale in the past. It is one of the most storied missionary schools in the country. Lovedale had educated generations of South African intellectuals, including Nelson Mandela's mentor, Walter Sisulu. So did many of the figures who would shape the liberation movement in South Africa. The Eastern Cape was, in a very real sense, the intellectual seedbed of African political thought in South Africa. Chris van Wyk noted, one Sunday afternoon, a young boy walked through the streets of a township. With a book under his arm, he headed for the shade of a tree in the veld. While the other boys played in the streets, he loved to sit on his own under a tree. Here you could read about the world and its people. The young people and the old people of the township all knew who that little boy was. There goes Steve Biko with his books. At Lovedale, Biko encountered one of his first collisions or direct collisions between his life and the apartheid state. In 1963, when Steve was 16 years old, his older brother, Kya, was arrested in suspicion of involvement with the armed wing of the Pan-Africanist Congress. Steve himself was picked up, interrogated by the police, and released without charges. Then Lovedale expelled him, not because he had done anything, because he hadn't, because he was connected, however tenuously, to someone the state considered dangerous. His brother noted, Steve had no care in the world for politics, but this was to change when he was expelled from Lovedale. This was when the great giant was awakened. Steve Biko himself says, from that moment onwards, I began to have a healthy disregard for authority. I hated authority like hell. Biko was refused entry to all schools in the area. He eventually completed his schooling in 1965 in another missionary school, Francis College, at Marion Hill Catholic Mission Station in Natal. Here he completed his matriculation with distinction. His teachers spoke of a student who argued everything, read incessantly, read insatiably, and had an unusual gift for cutting to the core of the question. He was, by all accounts, already a young man with something to say and the intellectual equipment to say it. At Marion Hill, Steve began to correspond with a father, Alred Stubbs, a teacher whom he had become acquainted with at Lovedale College. He questioned Father Stubbs about Christianity and why we can have values which seem to be good values, yet these values do not translate into action and address the oppression that was happening in South Africa at the time. I think that question is being asked a lot today still. In 1966, Steve Biko enrolled to study medicine at the University of Natal's non-European section. That phrase, non-European section, tells you everything you need to know about the environment he was entering. It was a physically separate campus from the white university. The facilities were inferior. The arrangement was designed to signal architecturally and administratively that Black medical students were being trained as sufferants, not by right. But universities, even the segregated ones, are places where ideas circulate. And in Biko's case, the indignity of segregation became the starting point for the most important philosophical work of his life. In I Write What I Like, he says, unfortunately, the books you read at university are in English, a second language to you. As a result, you never quite catch everything that is in a book. You certainly understand the paragraph, but you're not quite adept at reproducing an argument that was in a particular book. This makes you less articulate as a Black man and more inward-looking. The dominant student political organization at the time was NUSAS, the National Union of South African Students. It was largely white, broadly liberal, and generally opposed to apartheid. Black students were affiliated. Biko joined, and he paid close attention to what he found. In 1967, at the NUSAS conference, Black students were housed in segregated accommodation, separate from their white allies who had invited them to the gathering. Biko watched as white liberals who were vocally, sincerely opposed to apartheid nonetheless sleep in white-only hotels and eat at white-only tables because that was simply the social reality. But they had not thought deeply enough about their own participation in it. He did not hold it against them exactly, but he drew a lesson from it that would become foundational to everything he subsequently built. The lesson was this: liberal politics, however well-intentioned, casts Black people in a fundamentally passive role. The white liberal says, I will speak for you. I will advocate for you. I will include you in my movement and fight for your rights. But that framing, however generous, still positions the Black person as an object of someone else's agency, as someone acted upon, not acting. And Biko believed with growing certainty that this was precisely the wrong foundation for genuine liberation. When looking at some of these writing, there is one which clearly expounds his thoughts on this matter, which appeared in 1972's volume. Sorry, I just realized I didn't put the book where it was found, so apologies. Which was later banned, called Student Perspective on South Africa. And you can find this full text in the book of Biko. No race possesses the monopoly of beauty, intelligence, and force, and there is room for all of us at the rendezvous of victory. I do not think SASO was thinking about South Africa when he said those words. The whites in this country have placed themselves on a path of no return, so blatantly exploitative in terms of the mind and body is the practice of white racism that one wonders if the interests of Blacks and whites in this country have not become so mutually exclusive as to remove the possibility of there being room for all of us at the rendezvous of victory. It will not be long before the Blacks relate their poverty to their Blackness in concrete terms. Because of the tradition forced onto the country, the poor people shall always be Black people. It is not surprising, therefore, that the Blacks should wish to rid themselves of a system that locks up the wealth of the country in the hands of a few. No doubt Rick Turner was thinking of this when he declared that any Black government is likely to be socialist. We now come to the group that has longest enjoyed confidence from the Black world, the liberal establishment, including radical and leftist groups. The biggest mistake the Black world ever made was to assume that whoever opposed apartheid was an ally. For a long time, the black world has been looking only at the governing party and not so much at the whole power structure as the object of their rage. In a sense, the very political vocabulary that the blacks have been used has been inherited from the liberals. For a long time, in fact, it became the occupation of black leadership to calm the masses down while they engage in fruitless negotiation with the status quo. Of course, the situation could not last. A new breed of black leaders are beginning to suspect the involvement of liberals in a struggle they regarded as essentially theirs when the political movements of the blacks were either banned or harassed into non-existence. This left the stage open once more for the liberals to continue with their work of fighting for the rights of blacks. It never occurred to the liberals that the integration they insisted upon as an effective way of opposing apartheid was impossible to achieve in South Africa. One has to overhaul the whole system in South Africa before hoping to get black and white walking hand in hand to oppose a common enemy. As it is, both black and white walk into a hastily organized, integrated circle, carrying with them the seeds of destruction of that circle, their inferiority and superiority complexes. The myth of integration, as propounded under the banner of the liberal ideology, must be cracked because it makes people believe that something is being achieved when in reality the artificially integrated circles are a soporific to the blacks while solving the consciousness of the few guilt-stricken whites. It works from the false premise that because it is difficult to bring people of different races together in this country, achievement of this is in itself a final step towards the total liberation of blacks. The essence of politics is to direct oneself to the group which wields power. Most white descendant groups are aware of the power wielded by the white power structure. They are quick to quote statistics on how big the military defense budget is. They know exactly how effectively the police and the army can control protesting black hordes, peacefully or otherwise. They know to what degree the black world is infiltrated by the security police. Hence, they are completely convinced of the impotence of the black people. Why then do they persist in talking to the blacks? Since they are aware that the problem in this country is white racism, why do they not address themselves to the white world? In an effort to answer these questions, one has to come to the painful conclusion that the liberal is in effect appeasing his own conscience, or at best is eager to demonstrate his identification with the black people only insofar as it does not sever all his ties with his relatives on his side of the color line. Being white, he possesses the natural passport to the exclusive pool of white privilege, from which he does not hesitate to extract whatever suits him. Yet since he identifies with the blacks, he moves around his white circles, white-only beaches, restaurants and cinemas, with a lighter load, feeling that he is not like the rest. However, in the back of his mind is a constant reminder that he is quite comfortable as things stand, and therefore should not bother about change. Although he does not vote for the nationalists, now that they are in the majority anyway, he feels secure under the protection offered by the nationalists, as subconsciously, shuns the idea of change. I'm not sneering at the liberals and their involvement. Neither am I suggesting that they are the most to blame for the black man's plight. Rather, I am illustrating the fundamental fact that total identification with an oppressed group in a system that forces one group to enjoy privilege and to live on the sweat of another is impossible. White society collectively owes the blacks so huge a debt that no one member should automatically expect to escape from the blanket condemnation that needs must come from the black world. It is not as if blacks are allowed to enjoy privilege only when they declare their solidarity with the ruling party. They are born into privilege and are nourished by and nurtured in the system of ruthless exploitation of black energy. The liberals must fight on their own and for themselves. If they are true liberals, they must realize that they themselves are oppressed, and they must fight for their own freedom and not that of the blacks with whom they can hardly claim identification. What I've tried to show is that in South Africa, political power has always rested with white society. Not only have the whites been guilty of being on the offensive, but by skillful maneuvers, they have managed to control the responses of the blacks to the provocation. Not only have they kicked the black, but they have also told him how to react to the kick. A long time, the black has been listening with patience to the advice he has been receiving on how best to respond to that kick. With painful slowness, he is now beginning to show that he realizes it is his right and duty to respond to the kick in the way he sees fit. The call for black consciousness is the most positive call to come from any group in the black world for a long time. It is more than just a reactionary rejection of whites by blacks. The quintessence of it is the realization by the blacks that in order to feature well in this game of power politics, they have to use the concept of group power and to build a strong foundation for this. Being an historically, politically, socially, and economically disinherited and dispossessed group, they have the strongest foundation from which to operate. The philosophy of black consciousness therefore expresses group pride and the determination by the blacks to rise and attain the envisioned self. At the heart of this kind of thinking is the realization by the blacks that the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. Once the latter has been so effectively manipulated and controlled by the oppressor as to make the oppressed believe that he is a liability to the white man, then there will be nothing the oppressed can do that will really scare his powerful masters. Hence, thinking along the lines of black consciousness makes the black man see himself as a being entire in himself and not as an extension of a broom or additional leverage to some machine. At the end of it all, he cannot tolerate attempts by anybody to dwarf the significance of his manhood. Once this happens, we know that the real man in the black person is beginning to shine through. I've spoken of black consciousness as if it is something that can be readily detected. Granted, this may be an overstatement at this stage, yet it is true that gradually the various black groups are becoming more and more conscious of the self. They are beginning to rid their minds of imprisoning notions which are the legacy of the control of their attitudes by whites. Slowly, they can cast aside the morality argument which prevented them from going it alone and are now learning that a lot of good can be derived from the specific exclusion of whites from black institution. Of course, it is not surprising to us that whites are not much aware of these developing forces, since such consciousness is essentially an inward-looking process. We are aware that the white man is sitting at our table. We know he has no right to be there. We want to remove him from our table, strip the table of all the trappings put on it by him, decorate it in true African style, settle down, and then ask him to join us on our terms if he wishes. Now, the reason why this was put into the book by Donald Woods was that he was actually quite infuriated by this text, by this writing that Steve had done. He had seen it as racism, exclusion of one person, excluding white liberals, and calling them something very specific, which he did not. It didn't taste. It tasted a bit bitter in his mouth. They did have a conversation, and Steve did say, maybe I was being harsh, but the basics are really what we're talking about. We need to take control of our lives. We need to fight our battles from our perspectives and our experiences, and then we will invite you to come along with us on this journey, because discourse, conversation, and sharing is so important, but it will be on our terms once we have strengthened ourselves as as a people. That's essentially what he's saying. Okay. Again, another quote from Steve that just really just summarizes what I just said. It says, Blacks are tired of standing at the touchlines to witness a game that they should be playing. They want to do things for themselves and by themselves. So in July 1969, at the University of the North, known as Turfloop, Steve Biko and a group of colleagues, including Barney Patiana, Srina Mutli, and others, formally established the South African Students Association, SASO. Steve was elected its first president. SASO was deliberately and explicitly a Black organization. White students were not welcome. This surprised and sometimes offended the white liberals who had considered themselves allies. But Biko had a clear answer to the objections. It was not that the white people were the enemy. It was that Black people needed a space to organize, to think, to lead, without the dynamic of white approval and white permission shaping every conversation. You cannot develop psychological independence, he argued, while you are constantly looking sideways at white people to see whether they agree with you. The word Black in SASO's framework was itself a political statement, a deliberate reclamation. In Biko's usage, Black referred not only to Africans, but to all those designated non-white by the apartheid state, which would include coloreds, Indians, and Africans together. It was a coalition of the oppressed, defined not by ethnic origin, but by shared experiences of racial discrimination. Steve Biko in I Write What I Like says, we have defined Blacks as those who are by law or tradition politically, economically, and socially discriminated against as a group in South African society, and identifying themselves as a unit in the struggle towards the realization of their aspirations. He also wrote, we are oppressed not as Zulus, Xhosas, Vendors, or Indians. We are oppressed because we are Black. We must use that very concept to unite ourselves and to respond as a cohesive group. We must cling to each other with a tenacity that will shock the perpetrators of evil. This is where the SASO message and cry, Black man, you are on your own, becomes relevant. In Durban in early 1970s, Biko met Nonsakelelo Mashalaba, who came from Umtata in the Transkei. She was pursuing her nursing training at King Edward Hospital, while Biko was a medical student at the University of Natal. She says, I must say he was very politically involved then as president of SASO. I remember we used to make appointments, and if he does come, he says, take me to the station. I've got a meeting in Johannesburg tomorrow. So I happened to know him that way, and somehow I fell for him. She also says he used to say to his friends, meet my lady. She is the actual embodiment of Blackness. Black is beautiful. He was a smooth talker. He was charismatic. He was a ladies' man, from what I can tell. So Black consciousness was not at its core a political program in the conventional sense. It was a philosophical and psychological intervention. Biko's central argument was radical in its simplicity, and it has lost none of its force in the decades since he made it. He argued that the apartheid's most insidious achievement was not the pass laws, not the forced removals, not the economic exploitation. Devastating as all of those were, its most insidious achievement was psychological. It had convinced many Black South Africans over generations of systematic humiliation that they were inferior, that their culture was inferior, that their history was inferior, that they needed white people to think for them, to lead them, to define the terms of their own liberation. And that conviction, that internalized inferiority, was the deepest chain. It was the chain that would remain even if all the others were broken. That chain, in the smallest aspect that I can explain it. So when somebody comes to help you and the first thing they do, look at my husband and go, "Yeah, boss." And it's something that just breaks inside you. It's a small thing, but it's that giving reverence, right? It's that giving power. Where some people will say it's respectful. No, it's a learned behavior. The answer back always is, "My name is Sasha. I am not boss. I am not sir." I write what I like. He says, "The African child learns to hate his heritage in his days at school. So negative is the image of African society presented to him that he tends to find solace only in close identification with white society. Part of the approach of bringing about Black consciousness has to be directed to the past to seek to rewrite the history of the Black man and to produce in it the heroes who form the core of the African background." Don't know if you guys saw this conversation going on about, getting the prominence of Jan van Riebeeck and rewriting or refocusing the history by the basic education minister. How long have we been here? Yeah. So, very important. He also says, because the conqueror dictated what was right and what was wrong, he caused the development of an inferiority complex in the Black people. This prevents the Black man from articulating his aspirations and determining his future. Biko drew on a range of intellectuals to build this argument. Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth, a psychiatrist's analysis of the psychological damage inflicted by colonial systems, was central. So was Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and its accounts of how oppressive systems trained the oppressed to see themselves through the eye of the oppressor. And underlying all of this was a distinctly African communitarian philosophy, Ubuntu. The principle that the person is a person through other persons, that identity is rational, that community is constitutive of selfhood. The next quote is from I Write What I Like, and I think the same quote showed up, the same kind of wording that I spoke about when we spoke about the white liberals, but it's just a different spin. So, at the heart of Black consciousness is the realization by Blacks that the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed, which was in the earlier text. If one is free at heart, no man-made chains can bind one to servitude. But if one's mind is manipulated and controlled by the oppressor, then there will be nothing the oppressed can do to scare his powerful masters. Once you can make a man feel that he is inferior, it's not necessary to give him inferior education. He will seek inferior education for himself. Biko called the antidote to this condition psychological liberation. Before you can change the law, he argued, you must change your relationship to yourself. You must recognize yourself as fully human, as capable, as the author of your own story, as someone whose culture, whose history, whose intellectual tradition has value. Not because a white person has validated, but because it does. It is. One of the Durban Conference resolutions stated that emancipation depended entirely on the role Black people themselves were prepared to play. This doctrine of self-emancipation was defined as Black consciousness, which was an attitude of mind, a way of life. One of the key objectives of SASO was to address what they termed Black people's inferiority complex. As Frank talked, Biko wrote the following, inspired by Frantz Fanon's Black Skins, White Masks. It becomes clear that as long as blacks are suffering from an inferiority complex, a result of 300 years of deliberate oppression, denigration, and derision, they will become useless co-architects of a normal society. Hence, what is necessary as a prelude to anything else that may come is a very strong grassroots buildup of Black consciousness, such that Blacks can learn to assert themselves and their rightful claim. Steve also wrote, when you say Black is beautiful, you are saying, man, you are okay as you are. Begin to look upon yourself as human being. Again, another quote. The first step, therefore, is to make the Black man come into himself, to pump back life into his empty shell, to infuse him with a pride and dignity, to remind him of his complicity in the crime of allowing himself to be misused and therefore letting evil reign supreme in the country of his birth. This is what we mean by an inward-looking process. This is the definition of Black consciousness. This was not a counsel of passivity. It was a prerequisite for genuine political action. Biko believed that a movement built on self-respect and self-reliance would be fundamentally more durable than one built on white liberal charity. In June 1972, Biko was expelled from the University of Natal Medical School. At this time, he played a central role in forming the Black People's Convention, BPC, an umbrella body of Black consciousness organizations. The BPC was formally launched in Pietermaritzburg in July 1972 to fill the political vacuum created by the banning of the ANC and PAC more than a decade earlier. Biko was insistent that philosophy without practice was empty. Black consciousness in his hand was never merely theoretical. He and his colleagues translated their ideas into concrete community action through the Black community programs, a network of health clinics, literacy projects, and worker education initiatives in Black townships across South Africa. That's why I said this community member. Srini Moodley said, we emphasize the fact that students were a part of the oppressed community. Their parents worked in factories, and were domestic workers. We encouraged students to go into the communities and help with building extra classrooms and clinics. The most celebrated of this was the Zanampile Community Health Center, established in 1975 near King Williamstown in the Eastern Cape. Running the clinic was Dr. Phela Rampela, a remarkable medical doctor and activist who would become Biko's partner and the mother of his son, Flumelo. The clinic was staffed entirely by Black professionals, run according to Black consciousness principles, and provided healthcare to communities the apartheid state had comprehensively neglected. Zanampelo was, among other things, a demonstration. It was evidence, living and breathing, that Black professionals could build and sustain institutions of excellence without white supervision or white permission. The security police surveilled it constantly. That too was a kind of compliment. This is another quote from Biko, the book. It says, but he was always equally available and concerned about the very least. Just released from 101 days in detention, no charge, he helped to organize the annual Christmas party of a creche run by the Black Community Program. I could not attend as I had hoped, and he later generally reproached me for not being at what he recognized as a very important event. While the program's clinic doctor was in detention, he rushed around arranging locums for weekly outstation work, concerned that sick people would turn up and find nobody to treat them. It is impossible to reconcile this man with the image of a rabid revolutionary. His preferred path was always peaceable and constructive and creative. So we end the first episode here. We have now learned about Biko's start as a young man in Ginsburg, King Williamstown, about his first interaction with the apartheid government, which really radicalized him or made him hate authority. His expulsion from that school, his eventual rise and matriculation and going to medical school, then how involved he becomes there. This idea that gets built up through SASO, through Black consciousness, to Black community programs, shows us that his idea was not only about empowering people and allowing people to empower themselves, but to then extend that out into the community and make sure that as professionals that we are uplifting our people and taking care of our people where the government failed them. All his writing is so well put together, always very powerful, always very contextual, always very relevant. And I feel still relevant today. So come back next week where we will look at his friendship with Donald Woods. We will then go into his history of detentions until the fateful night. Okay. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you next week. Bye.